On December 17, 1986, Richard Kuklinski sat in a New Jersey diner waiting for what he thought was just another job. The man across from him was Dominic Polifrone, and they had been discussing a deal for weeks. Kuklinski trusted him. They talked about weapons, about hits, about the business. Kuklinski even bragged about his methods. He explained how he froze bodies to confuse investigators about time of death. He described killing over 100 people during his career as a contract killer for the mob. Polifrone nodded along, taking mental notes of everything. Then Kuklinski made his fatal mistake. He agreed to buy cyanide for a murder. The moment the words left his mouth, Polifrone gave a signal. Police officers surrounded the diner from every direction. Kuklinski reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Polifrone pulled out his badge. He was an undercover agent who had spent 18 months earning Kuklinski's trust. The Iceman, as they called him, was finally caught. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences and died in prison in 2006. Federal Judge John would walk toward his car in San Antonio, Texas. Harrelson watched through his rifle scope from a distance. He had been hired to eliminate Wood, who was known as Maximum John for his harsh sentences against drug traffickers. Harrelson steadied his aim and fired. The bullet struck Wood in the back. The judge collapsed and died minutes later. Harrelson thought he had executed the perfect hit. He collected his payment and disappeared. But the FBI launched the largest investigation since the Kennedy assassination. They traced the weapon. They followed the money trail. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Harrelson's wife, Jo, knew too much. Under pressure, she started talking. She revealed details about the murder that only the killer would know. The evidence mounted. Harrelson tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. In 1982, he was arrested and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. He died in prison in 2007, never admitting his guilt, but never escaping justice either. Alexander Litvinenko had been feeling sick for 3 weeks in November 2006. The former Russian FSB agent, now living in London, couldn't understand what was happening to his body. He had met with 2 Russian contacts at a hotel on November 1st. They shared tea. The conversation was brief and unremarkable. But days later, Litvinenko's hair started falling out. His immune system collapsed. His organs began failing one by one. Doctors ran every test imaginable. Nothing made sense. Then a specialist had a terrible realization. They tested for radiation. The results showed polonium-210, one of the most toxic substances on Earth, in lethal amounts. Someone had poisoned his tea. Litvinenko knew immediately who was responsible. From his hospital bed, he dictated a statement accusing the Russian government. On November 23rd, he died in agony. British investigators traced the polonium trail through London. It led directly to Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, the men who had shared tea with him. Both were former Russian agents. Russia refused to extradite them. They were tried in absentia and remain wanted for murder. On May 23, 1992, Judge Giovanni Falcone was driving on a highway near Palermo, Sicily, with his wife and 3 bodyguards. Brusca, one of the Sicilian mafia's most feared hitmen, had planned this assassination for months. He had packed half a ton of explosives underneath the highway. Now he waited on a hillside with a remote detonator, watching the judge's armored convoy approach. Falcone's security team had taken every precaution. They traveled in reinforced vehicles. They varied their routes. They moved quickly. But their very presence helped Brusca identify the right car. The moment the judge's vehicle reached the exact spot, Brusca pressed the button. The explosion was so powerful it created a crater in the highway. Falcone, his wife, and all 3 bodyguards died instantly. Brusca had succeeded. But the murder became Italy's turning point. The public outcry was massive. Police arrested hundreds of mafia members. Informants started cooperating. Brusca ran for 4 years, but in 1996, he was captured on a farm. He received life in prison and remains there today, despite controversial early release discussions. In 1963, a man made a terrible plan. At a hate group meeting, he told others he would commit a crime. He planned to hurt a civil rights leader named Medgar Evers, who was working to end segregation in Mississippi. Some people at the meeting encouraged this plan. Others helped him get ready. Even his wife knew what was coming. On June 12, 1963, the man hid near Evers' home with a weapon. When Evers returned home after midnight, the man fired. Evers was struck and died at the hospital an hour later. Police quickly found evidence connecting the suspect to the crime. His fingerprints were on the weapon. But during the 1960s, 2 juries refused to find him guilty. He went free and celebrated avoiding punishment. Many years went by. Eventually, his own family members decided to speak the truth. His wife testified about what he had told her. Others from the hate group revealed how he had bragged about the crime. In 1994, 31 years later, a new trial was held. This time, he was convicted. He received a life sentence and remained in prison until his death in 2001. Justice finally came, though it took 3 decades. On September 3, 2012, Griselda Blanco walked out of a butcher shop in Medellín, Colombia. She was 70 years old now, far from her days as the cocaine godmother who had ordered hundreds of murders in Miami during the 1980s. She had served 20 years in American prisons and been deported back to Colombia. She thought her violent past was behind her. But the families of her victims had not forgotten. A motorcycle approached the butcher shop. 2 men rode on it. The passenger pulled out a gun. He fired twice into Blanco's head, using the exact same method she had pioneered decades earlier. She collapsed on the sidewalk and died instantly. The motorcycle sped away and was never found. Colombian police investigated, but made no arrests. The killer had learned from the best. Blanco had invented the motorcycle assassination technique that drug cartels still use today. In the end, her own brutal methods were turned against her. In a Brooklyn bar in 1940, Abundando couldn't keep his mouth shut. He was a key member of Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, and he wanted everyone to know how dangerous he was. He bragged to friends about the ice pick murders. He described how clean the weapon was, how it left almost no trace. He laughed about the dozens of men he had killed for the mob. His nickname was the Dasher because of how quickly he could finish a job. What Abundando didn't know was that the walls were closing in. Abe Relis, another Murder Incorporated hitman, had been arrested and decided to turn informant. Relis knew everything. He knew about the murders, the methods, the victims. He gave prosecutors detailed testimony about Abundando's kills, including the brutal murder of George Rudnick in 1937. Abundando's own words came back to haunt him. Witnesses confirmed his barroom boasts. The prosecution built an airtight case, using his own arrogance against him. In 1942, Frank Abundando was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. He had talked himself straight into the death chamber. For nearly 2 decades, Santana was Brazil's most prolific contract killer, claiming to have murdered over 500 people between 1971 and 1991. He kept meticulous records of every hit. Names, dates, locations, payment amounts. He stored them in notebooks hidden in his home, documenting his career like a twisted accountant. He believed the records proved his professionalism, his reliability. He thought they made him untouchable because they showed how many powerful people depended on him. But in 1991, Brazilian police received a tip about Santana's activities. They obtained a warrant and raided his home. What they found shocked even veteran detectives. The notebooks contained a detailed confession to hundreds of murders spanning 2 decades. Santana had created the perfect evidence against himself. He couldn't deny a single killing. The documentation was too precise, too thorough. His own obsession with record-keeping had become his downfall. Santana was arrested and sentenced to 128 years in prison. He was released in 2007 after serving only 16 years due to Brazilian sentencing laws. Today he lives quietly, the man who documented his own destruction, a living reminder that even the most careful criminals can be undone by their own hands.